Hello, my name is Bradley Jameson. Today we'll be discussing funerary cannibalism in the Wari tribe of Brazil. This is for Psych 109, and we will continue now. First of all, the Wari people are an indigenous people of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. Up until the 1960s, they were actually unknown to the Western world. Nobody had a clue as to who they were, where they were, but when the white man came through and was making his way down through South America, lo and behold, they came across the Wari tribe. They were a hunter-gatherer society. They weren't farmers based on their resource and resource management abilities. And they were very spiritual people who believe that the nature itself controls the outcome of your life and the outcome of your afterlife and your spirituality. So they're very in tune with nature, the forest specifically because they lived in the Amazon. And they practiced funerary cannibalism all the way up until visitors actually made it unpopular to do so, which was, obviously unfortunate for their culture, but probably because it scared the average traveler coming through and visiting the Wari people. What is funerary cannibalism? Well, it's the roasting and eating of human flesh and organs after the death of a person. What that means is the person would have whoever it would be, whether it be the mother, the father, great-grandfather, their definition of who family is, who we'll get into a bit later, was here and there. But whenever the person would die, it was then custom for them to roast and eat most, if not all, of the person's body. And it was a way to them to eliminate the body in order to allow the spirit to be free. Unlike Western civilization, which rests our salvation basically on the afterlife and the salvation of the soul, the Wari firmly believe that both the spirit and the body are one and the same. In a social event, this is something that brought a lot of people together as far as it being a social event. It bring them all together for something, not necessarily the eating necessarily, but the talking and communicating about the person and that person's life. And it would also give a chance for the family to grieve. And they weren't able to finish their grievance and their grieving and their be bereaved up until the body was completely consumed. Sometimes they would even have to pulverize the bones into a powder and the inedible parts in order for them to find a way to eventually get that into and ingest them. And this wouldn't take just one night. This could take days, if not longer, in order to ingest the entirety of the individual. Now, what would it be like? Set the scene. So I'm sure for any Westerner, anyone outside of the tribe of the Wari, this would be a terrifying, terrifying event to witness. We are not accustomed to, or anyways, it is so taboo to even mention the word cannibalism in our society. Not just today, really, but any Western society ever. It was something that is not looked upon as any type of good or anything that we do in any of our practices as far as that's concerned. But it'd be a terrifying process nonetheless, as you can imagine. Basically, the family member would be brought in, the dead family member, that is, and they would be butchered, just like any other animal would be butchered as if you were going to eat them at that point, except there would be words and special incantations that would happen during the actual butchering process in order to ward off evil spirits that were lurking in the forest. Specific organs, would be eaten and given to certain family members, specifically like the heart and the brain would be given to, the mother, the father, those in need of more, like the children of the deceased would be allowed to eat some of the brain in order to gain the knowledge of that person and what he did or she did throughout their lives. And it's something that the entire tribe would be there for. So you can imagine this big gathering of people. Not everyone is there to consume that individual, just the family members, but the entire tribe is there, one, for support, and two, the entire tribe is there in order to make sure that they can also help ward off the evil spirits of the forest in order to keep any bad things from happening during this very emotional ceremony where people would be going through and discussing their family member, the deceased, much like we would today in any of our funeral ceremonies. And we would be discussing, their life and the things that they accomplished and going through that. But the difference, obviously, is that we are not going to consume someone. One, it's not healthy or safe, I'm sure. And two, it is very taboo and not required or needed in this society for us to do so today in a Western civilization. And today, as I've learned, this practice, even in the Wari, is very, very far and few between because of the fact that they are now basically almost westernized, if you will, because of all the contact they've had with the outside world. And the younger generation has no need for it. And the older generation is wanting to respect the old ways and still partake it sometimes in cannibalism after someone has died. Who participates in this ritual? Well, the body is only consumed by those who are considered family by birth, one by having some sort of sexual intercourse with someone in that family, some way of getting their essence, i.e., being nursed by as a child by the mother of that family, of the deceased person, or someone who has lived or ate food and slept under the same roof with a person, therefore shared their essence, as the scripts that I read talk about, and also are considered family if they shared their essence. So you can see up in their corner there's a small diagram that kind of shows the cycle of who to consider family, but that also does include someone who may not necessarily be part of their biological family, but who had eaten with them for years, lived under their roof, and or had been nursed by the mother if the mother is the one that passed in that cycle. So things that we learned in this course, some very important things. One was we learned about what grief was. So grief, as described by our lecture notes, tell us that it's a term that includes all of one's reactions, both internally and externally, to loss. Grief can be experienced and expressed in a lot of ways. Physically, you can physically be showing signs of grief, whether it be by crying, whether it be by being physically ill by the thought of your loved one being gone. Emotionally, through your feelings that you express outwardly. It can be seen if someone's grieving. Cognitively, being that through the thoughts that you have or the thoughts that someone else can pick up on what you're going through, you can definitely have and be grieving through your thoughts, where it's just going through your head nonstop all day, every day, and you can't do nothing but think about the grief factor involved in the scenario that you happen to be in at the time, where it may be. Behaviorally, you can see grief not just in children, but in adults as far as their behavior, whether that be a difference in the way that they're acting, whether it be they're acting more violent or abrupt, or they're being just out of the ordinary behaviorally to maybe what you knew that person to be when they weren't in a grief process. And it should be known. And socially, you can grief. You can tell when someone's in a grief process socially because they may decide to retract themselves from social situations, or perhaps insert themselves even more in an effort to dull the pain, if you will, from what they believe is happening to them. And then spiritually, you can grieve spiritually as well. Obviously, your spirits can be down, and you have to get things from whether it be the clergy, whoever you may believe in, or whether you don't believe in the spirit in a religious sense, but you believe in the spirit in some other sense. Whatever you consider your God figure to be, you can also invest in that as far as your grief is concerned, and it can be shown there as well. And then mourning. Mourning is another example of something we learned in our text. And it describes in our lectures that we talked, it was an essential process for those who are trying to cope with a loss and grief. It helps a bereaved person find that way to go forward within a healthful living and adapt to the new world in which they find themselves. While someone's mourning, it's also others, I wouldn't say responsibilities, but you have to interact with those people who are mourning, know the signs, and understand that you have a certain responsibility if you choose to interact with those people to make sure that you're the best person you can be for them as far as during their mourning process, through listening, adaptive listening, all different things like that. Mourning has two complementary forms. One being internal, meaning the private interpersonal process that you may go through, your inward struggle to cope with or try to manage both the loss of your grief and the reaction to that loss. Some call this grieving, obviously, but it's still under the internal complement of mourning itself when we go through mourning. And then outward, meaning public or interpersonal processes. the overt, the visible, and the shared expressions of grief together, and the efforts to obtain social support from other people. We are social beings as humans, and we need support from others. And when we are finding ourselves in the throes of grief or mourning, we have to lean on others, and we tend to. And if we don't, those are the signs that we're looking out for as well. Someone who completely cut themselves off, and when you know they should be going through a grief or a mourning process. So it's a responsible thing for you to do if you're a friend or a loved one, is to have an open ear and find out what it is that they need from you at the time and how it is you can help, and not overwhelm them with a lot of million different things you have going on, but just to be there for them and their needs specifically. We also discussed bereavement, which identifies the objective situation of an individual who has experienced the loss of some persons or things that they valued. That was in our book, in our text as well. The Wari people experience bereavement in a different context than perhaps Westerners do. We're accustomed to. They will experience the same loss and feelings that Westerners do, but they choose to give their bereavement cycle a finite ending by only allowing that grieving to occur and last up until that body of that loved one is consumed. So what we would call that, as we were going through our texts and learning, was a task-based model in a sense. So when you think of it in that aspect, the Wari are finding something that they can focus their bereavement and grief into, which is this ritual, which is going to, which is obviously the cannibalism of their loved one. And through that, the trouble-based model, we learned that Charles Nutter tell us that next to using a task-based model for dealing with dying, can give focus in a very unfocused scenario by putting some control of how we die into the hands of the person dealing with the issue, rather than floundering about aimlessly to deal with dying. So that particular piece of text that I took there was from a chapter that was talking about the individual themselves learning or dealing with themselves, knowing they're going to die, but it's still applicable and just as applicable to the bereaved, meaning the people or someone who needs that task after the fact that someone has died. They also can use this model as well to put into perspective how can they get themselves thinking about the subject, not ignoring it, working through the problems that they're having or their grief. And this ritual of cannibalism after the fact of someone had died for the Wari people was just that. It was a task they could put themselves into. It only involved the whole tribe as far as bringing people together in order to do things, and it gave them a purpose, a point, and more importantly, as a task-based model, it gave them specifically a way to focus their energy. And when they did, there was an ending to the whole thing. When they were done with the process, their grief in their eyes was allowed to end and to be over, which is something that, even in modern day grieving and bereavement, when you help someone in a Western society to find that end point, you may never find it, or you may find it. You have to find that personally within yourself when you're the one who is bereaved or grieving, of when it's okay, in a sense, to move on. That was this task for the Wari people. When the body was finally consumed and done, they were able to know and sit with peace, knowing that they had taken care of their relative. What is beautiful or meaningful and or hopeful about this tradition, in my opinion, although it's a social taboo in our culture, obviously, to eat someone, I think in most cultures it is today, obviously, but you never know. It's still a respect and expression of grievance and a spiritual cleansing, that this ritual still holds beauty and meaning to me in the following ways. One, the symbolism of retaining your loved one with you by making them a part of you. That was really what the Wari were focusing on here, was that their loved one was now a part of them physically and spiritually. And then to me, it was the purity of concept that nothing went to waste as the body is consumed. If you think about it, the Christian faith still does this today symbolically with the sacrament and the communion. When you go, you're eating Christ's body and drinking his blood. Now, that is meant to be metaphorical in this sense, but in the realism of what it is that you're supposed to think about what you're doing, you are talking about consuming the body of Christ through eating his flesh and drinking his blood. So it's really not that far-fetched for us to assume that in some culture somewhere, which was void of Christian influence at the time, that this would still be something that was relevant to them to do. And then also, and lastly on this, was the beauty of the concept that your actions will ensure that your relative lives a long and beautiful afterlife. That there's something to be said for that. You know, in most Western societies, if you don't have a faith to fall back on, if you don't have anything else, it's kind of hard to maybe try and put in perspective what it is or where it is your loved one is going or going to be after death. Although this to us seems like a violent action to actually consume and to eat someone, the Wari saw it as a beautiful point of they now ensure through their actions the ability for their loved one to be, for their culture, one with the forest spirits from the Amazon, that they would now be able to walk the forest happy and would not become a tainted spirit, which is what I read about. And that tainted spirit, which was with someone who didn't have this done for them, who didn't have a family who was able to make sure the ritual was completed properly, and now they travel and work the forest as an evil entity, basically, which are the ones that the tribe and the family were trying to ward away during their ritual, trying to ensure their families welcoming into the afterlife, if you will. Yes. So those are my references. That completes the talk for today on the cycle of the Wari and funerary cannibalism. Once again, this is for Psych 109. And my name was Bradley Jameson. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.